All right, welcome back, everyone. So I'm going to turn to Darcy Vetter first, and she has a long and storied, fabulous career. But specifically, we're calling upon her expertise in agricultural trade this morning. She was the chief agricultural negotiator for the USTR. So um, I would love, Darcy, if you wouldn't mind just providing us with a bit of context and responding if you have any comments on Phil and Augustine's recommendations. We'll also be discussing this further in the panel and diving a little bit deeper. So, Darcy, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center for hosting this morning. And really just my congratulations to the task force for, getting to this point where they have developed and can unveil these recommendations. It's an excellent piece of multi-stakeholder work, and the complexity of these issues really require that kind of approach. So appreciate being part of this morning. As Virginia noted, I'm not a labor expert. So in some of the details about how these programs work, I am probably not the best reference, but I have spent, as Virginia noted, a long time working at that intersection between agriculture and trade, and negotiating free trade agreements and implementing them, including for a long time as a younger civil servant, I was on the NAFTA implementation portfolio and worked closely with colleagues north and south, both on the environmental provisions of the NAFTA agreement as well as the agriculture ones. And then, of course, in later years, working both at USDA and at USTR on negotiating new agreements like the TPP and enforcing NAFTA as well. And really, I think it's already been noted that Mexico and the United States are each other's top agricultural export destination or import destination. And critically important to our agricultural economies is, of course, access to each other's markets. And so our trade system and our labor systems are just intrinsically linked. And I think it's safe to say that as we strengthen and provide sort of greater certainty and consistency in one aspect, it has an impact on the other. And so our trade and labor systems can be mutually reinforcing, or similarly, when we see disruptions in either, that can also, cause disruption in the other. And there are of course, we have seen, and I think the reason I'm here today is that there's uncertainty about what our trade policy will look like going forward, and that, of course, could ripple into the labor market as it has changes on production and destination for our agricultural goods. So I thought a little bit of what I would do today is just level set sort of how our trade agreements specifically are structured in ways that try to reinforce many of the things that this task force has been focused on in terms of labor standards and consistency, and what kind of the underlying principles are for what we are driving for in that trading conversation. And so when I think about trade and labor, and I think about labor provisions in our trade agreements, I think about one, encouraging what we've heard so much about this morning, which is better labor standards and fair labor practices. And, trying to integrate into trade agreement language, specific provisions saying, you shouldn't look the other way on your export oriented farms, right? You shouldn't not enforce your labor standards in order to get ahead or to make cheaper product, or, have a trade advantage. That has long been language in our trade agreements. It was not really in NAFTA, because NAFTA was negotiated in the mid-90s. We dealt with labor and environment more in a cooperative way as side agreements. But the renegotiation of NAFTA into USMCA really brought those labor provisions, and Augustine referred to this already, into the agreement to say not only should you just not fail to enforce those things, but we should look at raising standards and having to demonstrate that you're doing so in the context of the agreement. So USMCA really does have some of the strongest provisions about that. But I think it's also true, and one of the principles for first putting those types of provisions in trade agreements was the cry for fairness, right? We didn't want there to be a race to the bottom, that countries that just didn't have good labor and environmental standards could sell cheaper goods and then undercut goods from countries like the US that would say we have strong standards in these areas. And so you didn't want to facilitate that. There needed to be a sense of sort of fairness or sort of equal standards in trade. And so that was, kind of that motivation, both encouraging higher standards, but also making sure there's a level playing field. But I think it's also important to note that some of the conditions that keep trade, particularly in agricultural products, more consistent are also in those trade agreements and provide important context. And that is, commitments on sharing of information, using high scientific standards, and coordinating closely on issues of plant and animal health and disease and food safety. And so, one of the things I think sometimes as trade officials we would take for granted was just the depth and the breadth of the relationships that we had with our Mexican and our Canadian counterparts. So if there was a food safety scare or an outbreak of avian influenza, we knew who to call to try to make sure that we dealt with those things effectively because we knew that they impacted producers in all of our countries, but that we kept trade flowing to the extent possible. It didn't, completely shut down the border. We could quickly isolate the problem and keep things moving. And so that trade infrastructure provides not just through tariffs, but for a lot of these coordination and health and safety and other mechanisms, ways that provide consistency. And, last and certainly not least, I think what trade agreements provide through some of the mechanisms I provided, but also obviously through the economic terms of trade through tariffs, they provide certainty and they require transparency. And so people have consistent, transparent, and reliable terms of trade. Really, NAFTA and USMCA are a perfect example of this. If you look at how highly integrated our three markets are, that certainty has been able to sort of drive investment, both in actual production, but in the infrastructure to make the flow of those goods north and south much more easy and efficient and regular. And so, I think that if that certainty is in question, that may also then slow down investment. And one of the things I heard in these recommendations, and investment both in new relationships, but also the care and maintenance and feeding of those current export markets that we have, was that all of these recommendations require some skin in the game from governments, from the producers of agricultural products, and from the workers themselves who need to enroll in and educate themselves of their rights so that they can take advantage of these programs. And if it looks as though the amount and the terms of trade may be changing, will workers choose to, or will employers choose to invest in some of the systems and enrolling more formally? Will they know how many H-2A workers they will need? Will they, will they increase the demand for these systems that might help them work more efficiently? So I think, that the speakers have really stressed that all those stakeholders, right, will be needed to support and make the systems work. If none of those stakeholders are quite certain that trade flows will be what they were in the past, or that there's that opportunity for growth, I think you could see a little bit of a chilling effect there in implementing them. So, for me, the infrastructure around trade between Mexico and the US, and I would include Canada here too, is really quite extraordinary if you think about what has developed since NAFTA has first gone into force, for example. But maintaining that infrastructure really does depend on both our labor systems and our trade systems being sort of certain and reliable. And so as we think about what might transpire, those are some things to keep in mind, and we can talk about those a little bit later in the panel.
Thank you so much, Darcy. Yeah, and I think it's thank you so much for providing that context because, we're aware that all of these policy recommendations, although we've been researching them for many years, are being launched in an environment in a very kind of fluid situation and context in terms of trade. And so just kind of getting a grip of the landscape is really important. And yeah, this question of uncertainty and how it impacts private sector concerns, as well as, both governments trying to figure each other out in the first months of two new presidential administrations on both sides of the border. Um,
Absolutely.
and so we've heard a lot from kind of a more high level, but now I'd love to turn to Laura Ann. As a human geographer, you have sort of a better sense of what's going on the ground in agricultural communities in the US, and how both these recommendations could play out, but then also as well, just sort of scene setting. Um, yeah, just sort of how all of this context of uncertainty is affecting, real people.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to comment. So I'm Laura Ann Minkoff-Zern. I'm an associate professor of geography at Syracuse University. My own work focuses on workers across the food system, so from farm work all the way through transportation and service work. And I focused a lot in my career on farm labor and farm labor organizing, as well as immigrants that are starting their own farms in the United States, which is actually something that's oftentimes less out of the conversation, but is happening at a much quicker rate than people realize. Um, so I guess just starting with kind of where I enter this conversation is thinking really about who workers are in the United States. Oftentimes we really talk about them in economic terms, in terms of kind of the labor they provide. But I think as Augustine pointed out, they're coming here with very specific knowledge and skills. Many of them come from owning their own farms in Mexico and Central America. Um, and even if they're coming just from being farm laborers, they come with a lot of training. And I think that that's really important when we talk about kind of this notion of unskilled labor and kind of who does that narrative benefit. Not that I'm hearing that today, but I think just like stepping back to how we think about farm workers. We're really quite, as everyone has noted here, this relationship between the US and Mexico and our entire food system, really, not just in farm work, but is very dependent upon this kind of flow of commodities and also of people. Um, and I think also there's kind of this bigger history to understand that, along with it being very skilled labor, we have a history, as Phil was noting, of kind of people leaving rural areas and going to urban areas, of course, globally, but particularly in the United States. So we don't have that labor or knowledge existing within domestic, US born populations anymore, along with, a very deep history of kind of racialized, workers in the US in agriculture, and it being just historically a low wage job. And I think that that is also important to think about in the context of that farmers themselves are not making much of the food dollar. And I think we have to, when we're thinking about policy, really think bigger about why is it that, that farm work has been so low waged. And as Phil said, right, you can't squeeze water from a stone. So the farmers themselves don't have a lot more to spend too. Um, and I think when we think about kind of labor and trade policy, thinking about our bigger food policies is really important. Um, and I don't know if we want it, we could talk about that more in the panel. I don't think I have to talk about why this is so important. I think everyone probably that's here knows, the importance to both, consumers and people in agriculture. Um, but I also think something to bring into this conversation, thinking about what types of rural communities that we want to see. So, who do we want to see in farming? Who do we want to support in farming, both on the level of farm ownership and farm labor? Do we want to just be bringing people in as workers, or do we see them as community members, right? Do we see them as people with limited rights, or do we see them as, either community members with full rights, or workers, right, with regulations that are being followed. And I don't think we have a very good landscape today in those terms. Um, as far as some comments on the recommendations, I really can speak, more to the US side of things. But I think, as was noted, we've been moving towards kind of mechanization and guest worker programs and away from undocumented and unauthorized workers really for about 2 decades now. This is not a new thing. It hasn't been, this is not just this administration or the last administration. This has been going on for many years. And Phil's work, I think, documenting the growth of H2A has been very helpful for those of us that look at these things. I guess I would kind of take issue with kind of the just acceptance that, we're going to go towards bigger and bigger farms. We're going to consolidate, so let's get those farms to follow the rules. While I understand that recommendation, I think we have to question more if we can just accept the further consolidation of agriculture and what that means both for our environment, what that means for our diets, what that means again for our rural communities. We're actually at a point where we're going further into investment firms really owning agriculture and owning land, and questioning if that's really who we want in control of our food system. So I think there are people that want to be able to farm, that want to be good employers, that are really struggling to compete on both of those levels. So I think we do need to support farm labor policy. We need policy that also supports small and mid-sized farms and doesn't overlook them. And like was presented, I do think that mechanization in H2A really does favor, and I could talk about my own research on this later, but it really does favor larger farmers. And I don't want to just go with, that's okay. We're going to go in that direction anyways. Um, and then finally, I'll just end with a little bit on, worker experiences in terms of H2A. One thing that was mentioned, but I think is important to really pay attention to, is that with H2A currently, a worker is brought in with one employer. There's no way to change employers, which I think, if you from a worker standpoint is really problematic and leaves to just an opening for abuse of the system and a lot of vulnerability for those workers. So worker advocates are really pushing, to change that, to say that workers can change employers, which seems like a pretty basic kind of human right in terms of labor standards. So workers do want, I've talked to many H2A workers, I've talked to many H2A employers, and the workers coming under H2A do want that option to come under H2A, but they do want, as Phil noted, much better oversight, but they also want more flexibility. And I guess I just point in Washington State, the organization Community to Community, which is a farm worker organizing group, um, actually push the state to create a fund to provide oversight of H2A. So we do have a model of that. It was worker led though, and it's only statewide. It's not federal, but I think they've created a really good model for us to have policy that says H2A actually needs oversight. We can't just increase the program and not look at what's happening on the ground. So I'll end there. I think there's a lot for us to talk about.
Yes, thank you so much for presenting that because I think, and I've received multiple questions from the audience that are touching on the points that you just raised in terms of, yeah, how do we just provide workers with a sense of agency, with kind of thinking of them as people rather than them as robots that harvest our food, but can do so better than an actual robot because of skill. And so to that point, a question for Phil and Augustine from Karina Barrios, who is one of our wonderful task force members who works at Coneval in Mexico. She asks that, in both sets of policy recommendations for the US and Mexico, we talk about educating, the importance of educating agricultural workers on their rights, educating employers. But how do we establish a mechanism or regulation that leads both countries to improve this education? Sort of like, what do we mean? Can we be more specific about what education means in that sense, and from sort of the ground up, but also being supported by, institutions here? So, Phil, why don't we go over to you first?
Well, I guess, in many cases, so in my experience talking to farm workers, most farm workers know and understand the minimum wage. They may not always get the minimum wage, but they understand what it is. People often say the cell phone has been the number one tool increasing worker power in agriculture over the last 2 decades. So that has happened. I think that what, in my experience, tends to happen is that we do have a complex farm labor system, and workers may not value benefits that cost money to the employer, but they don't think they'll ever benefit from. So employers can save a lot of money by not participating. So a very typical case wrapped up a few months ago is a farm labor contractor in Mexico. Payroll taxes maybe add 33% to wages. In the US, it's depending on the workers' compensation insurance premium, it's somewhere between 25 and 35%. And so it's very common, or not very common, but some labor contractors do not pay payroll taxes on some or all of the worker wages as are required. And that is a way to save money. Workers may or may not be educated about that, but it comes to light when a worker, for example, is injured and there is no workers' compensation insurance. And then we realize it's a problem. The reason we have the programs is so that it is a sort of a seamless thing that you don't have to go through some special procedure to get taken care of. I mean, we know that workplace accidents happen. What I keep saying is that we need a mechanism for the government or compliance officials to more easily detect business models that depend on non-compliance. So what I would love to see is an app that workers can upload their pay stubs, for example, and have artificial intelligence applied to it so that we can detect. I mean, experienced investigators already know where to go looking for high levels of non-compliance. And it is often smaller labor contractors, smaller growers in commodities that are not very profitable. But workers could play a role if they could upload their pay stubs, and we could have some mechanism for checking that. For example, I mean, given that we have such a big labor contractor role, if a labor contractor is offering to bring workers to a farm and charging an overhead of less than 30% in California in 2025, that's a red flag, or a yellow flag at least, that there's probably something going on, because that is a very difficult proposition to make profit. So if we required contracts and got some database of commissions, that would help going up. Of course, anything that empowers workers so that they come forward and make complaints. I mean, there are very few farm worker complaints. The US Department of Labor investigates about 1,000 farms a year. And from farm workers, they're getting 20, 30 complaints. Not really very many. Most of it is not complaint driven. And so that's what a lot of education aims to do. Know your rights, therefore complain if they're. I think we need more of that. But I guess I've looked at it from the other end. How can you make the enforcement agencies more efficient? And then, of course, the big role that private buyers and other private players the power they can exert to induce compliance. Let me stop there.
No, I think that's great, Phil. And I like your point about, you know, as well, rather than putting the onus on workers to complain and stand up for themselves, especially in as we've mentioned, a sort of fluid, not only trade, but migration landscape, putting the onus instead on enforcement mechanisms. So that's, a lot of what these policy recommendations aim to do as well. And so, Augustine, for you too, in Mexico, how do you see, I mean, a lot of what your policy recommendations get to is this question of empowering, educating workers on their rights and their access to social programs. So maybe just speak on that a little bit more.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone, by the way. Well, I wanted to say a couple of things before that. Number one is we'll probably say in the near future that tariffs changed everything, and that what happened with Mexican exports is tariffs, or the threat of tariffs. And I agree, tariffs are important. But things are changing, and they have been changing in Mexico for the past 2 years. And that's not related to tariffs. And I want to say Mexican exports have slowed, both in agriculture and in manufacturing. And that has to do with the falling dollar, the super peso that we had for about 2 years. So it was a fairly long period in which Mexican exporters got fewer pesos for their export dollars. High interest rates, which charged a lot to producers, and rising competition from Chile, Peru, and from other countries, um, which is fine. But right now, and I'll come back to tariffs, right now tariffs are being threatened on Mexico. And if we are to speak about a level playing field, we must at least, at the very least, make sure that not just Mexico only gets the tariffs. There's lots of competitors out there, and we should at least ensure that there's not unfair competition in that respect. I mean, several of these new entrants to the export markets are paying lower wages than Mexico. And I said many Mexican states are paying lower wages than the minimum, but even those lower wages are much higher than they were 10 years ago. So there has been a very significant improvement, and we shouldn't let those conditions, which are not ideal, I repeat, but have been improving, deter us from continuing to export. Second, the most satisfied workers in Mexico, and this is not a survey we did, it's a survey that an export company did 6 years ago. They work for, how can I say, a medium-sized farm, a medium-sized export farm. So a medium-sized export farm that has professional advice or professional employees, but at the same time where the owning family is on site. And so they can entertain complaints or actually interact with the workers. That's where the workers are most satisfied. So the workers are not most satisfied in the largest farms because it's very impersonal, and the gang leader or the foreman or woman is the one actually handling workers. And I mean, she is the boss. So it's this other environment where we have the best working conditions, and we shouldn't lose that sight of that as we try to improve working conditions. Third, the relevance of services. Everyone in our task force agrees that farm workers deserve better services, and most farm workers are already paying for those services, but they're not getting them. So we should make sure that they do get them. And finally, yes, even with very good employers where we interviewed workers a year ago, the workers were not aware of most of the rights, and they were not aware of what they have to do to get paid maternity leave, paid sick leave, or how to make sure that you're saving towards retirement, etc. So we need a lot of education and information. And to that end, I mean, many of the organizations in our task force actually do that, so that's good. But we are also engaging universities in all export states to make sure that they collaborate with us to multiply education campaigns on farms for farm workers. And that includes some of the groups in our task force that work with farm workers in southern Mexico. So and that also includes translating some of the educational materials that we have developed, comic books, videos, podcasts, into Mexican languages. We haven't done enough of that, but we have done some of that, and we hope to continue to be able to do it.
Thank you, Augustine. And thank you also for really connecting the dots between, the US-Mexico trade relationship and the size and kind of quality of, export versus domestic producing farms in Mexico, because I think that that's something that's not very well understood in the US. And so from there, I would love to bring Darcy back into this conversation to talk about trade. It's been, if anybody has been paying attention to any bit of news recently, it's hard to avoid this potential imposition of 25% tariffs on Mexico, and of course that the possibility of then Mexico imposing retaliatory tariffs. So again, sort of on a high level, I'm curious in a world where we have a tariff situation of this nature, coupled with more aggressive immigration enforcement, a mass deportation strategy. Darcy, how do you see this affecting the agricultural landscape in the United States, consumer prices? And then, this is a long question, but sort of what cards do you see the Trump administration kind of having? And then where do you also see blind spots here?
Well, maybe I'll start with the beginning of your question, right? Which is where what might tariffs or mass deportations or some of these levers that the new administration has talked about pulling, what are they trying to achieve with them? And I think that is still revealing itself maybe in a new administration. So we've seen President Trump and his members of his cabinet, et cetera, talk about tariffs doing a lot of different things. We've talked about them raising revenue, that we need to, charge, he says other countries, but of course we know importers actually pay the tariffs as a source of revenue so we can lower taxes elsewhere, that other countries should be paying their fair share in that way. The higher the tariff, the less product is shipped, so it doesn't become a very good source of revenue, right? So you have kind of competing claims. You've seen a discussion of tariffs as a way to boost US manufacturing and to sort of protect industries that are critical to the economy. You look at the metals tariffs that were just announced on steel and aluminum. The stated purpose is getting at some unfair practices and overcapacity, particularly in China. But, the assertion here is if you just put the tariffs on China, it simply, reroutes itself through country markets. And so they're taking a broader action. And then, of course, last but not least, are tariffs that are meant as leverage for something that have nothing to do with trade at all. And the tariffs that were originally announced and now delayed for 30 days on Mexico and Canada were, of course, about migration and fentanyl, or at least their stated purpose was that, right? But there were also a lot of little side statements to say we can't have illegal crossings of our border. Fentanyl is killing us, and that trade balance really bothers me too, right? So 30 days from now, will it be about satisfactory programs to curb fentanyl? Or will it really be, but we also need to balance trade and trade deficits, which is something that's of real concern. So, certainly both tariffs and, deportations are leveraged to sort of make the border more secure, to stop an inflow of migrants that has been significant and that, politically was really a source of, concern. You heard it over and over in the campaign. So maybe both of those levers continue to be pulled. Maybe you find other avenues to address fentanyl and, migration other than mass deportation. And, on the mass deportation side, that has been a theme, right? That we want to take those who should not be here and, and deport them, right? Get them out of the United States. The message on those who are here legally and who are providing really important services to our economy has been a little bit more muddled, right? And so politically front and center has been the deportation. Can this administration walk and chew gum at the same time? I think the ag community has been consistent, although perhaps somewhat muted, in saying, hey, wait a second, this is a really significant labor force here. And simply, mass deportation would have a massive impact on our ability to produce. Similarly, for our ag sector, most of the conversation about trade and tariffs has been about protecting things on the domestic side, but of course the retaliatory tariffs that would hit from a US perspective, the ag sector is very export dependent. 1 in 3 acres of what we grow goes outside the United States, and our trading partners know it. And if you look at the retaliatory lists, I think people were pleasantly surprised that China didn't go immediately to agriculture in its retaliatory list. But, Canada's list had a number of ag products on it. So, I do think that both of those things would be disruptive. But I think in terms of how it would affect prices and which particular sectors products will be hardest hit, it kind of depends, right? I mean, if you look at what we trade throughout with our USMCA partners, it's a lot and it's everything, right? It's commodities, it is fresh fruits and vegetables, it's dairy. If you look at something like pork or beef, we're importing the feeder pigs from Canada to then send pork back or to send it down to Mexico. So just like you often hear discussed in like automobile markets, a lot of those ag products are going back and forth across borders. Think about fertilizer imports. If those had a 25% tariff from Canada, that would absolutely affect the cost structure and the output of US agriculture and would raise prices both for consumers in the US, but also make our exports of those products that now have costlier imports less competitive globally. And, to that, I think we have to consumers ultimately pay for the tariffs, right? I think most of the economic models have shown that. And I think a lot of the products we're talking about are essential for life, health, nutrition. And probably not the target people necessarily have in mind when they talk about leveling the playing field. But the other thing about taxes on things like food is that they tend to be regressive. And those who feel the most are, of course, those who can least afford it and who may have to make unhealthier choices in a high tariff environment. So, again, I think that Laura Ann and Augustine made some good points just about how integrated our systems are from our communities and our workers and, those health outcomes we want to see. So, and the tools so far being discussed in that economic and that migration relationship are pretty blunt ones, right? And that if we really want to solve these problems, tariffs alone, deportation alone, probably aren't going to get us there. We will have to look at those complex ties we have amongst our economies and think about what are the conditions we want to see. And then last but not least, I forgot to mention when you asked about what would the impact be on consumer prices, and markets adjust. And the US and Mexico, though, are highly integrated and highly reliant on each other and have built, as I noted before, infrastructure and other systems to make that trading easy and efficient. But we're not the only games in town. The United States has increasing competition in commodities from Brazil, from Eastern Europe, and in wheat and other products like that from Australia, New Zealand. Where we used to be the more dominant supplier, we're not in everything. And so if our products are more expensive, we will feel it. Similarly, Mexico is a key provider of some of those fruits and vegetables that Phil noted earlier. Chile, Peru, a number of other players are really increasing both the quantity and the quality of what they can provide. And so you probably will see some shifting and substitution there.
Thank you, Darcy. And I love the comparison of like cow or meat products to cars because I think you always read in the news about how many times a car will cross, the US-Mexico border or the Canadian border for manufacturing purposes, but it is the same with beef products and pork products as well. The feed or, as livestock and then as it's slaughtered. So it's fascinating just how interconnected the economies are along so many different nodes of the supply chain. And as well, thank you for outlining, how tariffs really do affect citizens, just everyday consumers. I think that oftentimes it can be a little bit difficult to parse, but you laid that out well. And to go to Laura Ann on this, what we talked about in our webinar on, I believe, January 30th, was how this kind of uncertain migration landscape is affecting agricultural communities. But as well, I'm curious your thoughts on how the uncertainty in terms of the future of trade with Mexico and Canada is impacting agricultural communities, both workers, employers, small farmers. Is that something that folks are considering or yeah.
I think Darcy spoke to a lot of this, but just the generally integrated nature of agriculture. I think the smaller the farm, oftentimes the more that they're trying to have a closed loop system, but those are pretty extremely small farms and don't really make up a large proportion of US agriculture. I think for the vast majority of farmers, particularly those in the middle and those of the very large scale, yeah, they're really dependent upon a much larger, agriculture and food system. The mid-sized to small-sized farmers that, I would like to see generally supported, of course, or more integrated into local and regional food systems, and I think have so many benefits, both in terms of, sustainability and ecology, local economies, but as to Phil points, not necessarily the best employers and struggle to be good employers. But I think, for the vast majority of US growers, they're very dependent upon our global food system, both as grain exporters, as fertilizer importers, as, people purchasing a lot of machinery. And so these trade agreements, as they are so much the backbone really of agriculture globally today, we're not going backwards, right? We're not the notion that, we can just cut off tariffs and somehow reset. Um, it's not realistic, I think, as most people know that work in this field at all or pay attention. I think if we do want to see, um, you know, a big policy shift, it can't just be trying to like cut the system that we have. It has to be supporting the system that we want, right? And that would be price supports for farmers. That would be, supporting fresh and fruit vegetable production and not just supporting commodity crop growers. That would be diversifying really a big scale policy shift in how we do agricultural funding, how we think about migration. So I'm someone that, has not always necessarily been the biggest, fan of just more and more trade because I want to see small regional and local farmers be supported. And oftentimes they can't compete with export farmers, and we see a lot of issues there. But at the same time, that system's not going to change by just putting more tariffs on it, right? If we want to support these regional and local food systems and farmers and workers that are already part of those systems, there need to be more elements of how we're going to do that. And just changing our trade system is not going to achieve it. It's going to put a lot of people in a very vulnerable position very quickly.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm curious to know, yeah, sort of Phil's input on that. How do we capture, I mean, and we spoke to this at the beginning as well in the first presentation, but what are ways that we can try to capture these smaller and medium-sized farms, especially in an environment with, potentially increased immigration enforcement, and so that will force perhaps more imports or more mechanization or more H2As. What are the trade-offs for these alternatives, and how will they affect different farm sizes differently?
Well, I'm mindful of time, and one could spend a lot of time on this, but I think there are two last thoughts to leave you with. One is, you know, basically the things we're talking about, tariffs, mass deportations, other things, they will likely accelerate trends that are already underway. And what are those trends that are already underway? It's more mechanization, more migrant H2A workers, more imports. Tariffs could reverse that. But picking up on what Darcy said, remember, late fruit and vegetable agriculture is very capital intensive. It costs $100,000 or more to grow an acre of strawberries, $150,000 for raspberries. When you have uncertainty, whether it's tariffs or deportation or the value of the dollar, that slows down investment. And so people want to have certainty of investment. Or what I think has been happening is it encourages investment by big players who take long time horizons. Why are we getting pension funds and insurance companies and family offices investing huge amounts of money in agriculture? I mean, the simple answer is they say they don't make more land, but these are people who take a very long time horizon, and they're willing to play or understand the ups and downs in the road. It's everything that goes against what I am once, the small and medium-sized grower, who now reaches a crossroads and says, do I really double down and take the equity I've built up over the last 30 or 40 years in my land and turn it around and try a moonshot on how I can keep going with fewer workers? I mean, maybe, maybe not. But I think that the period we're in increases uncertainty and in a way favors those who are willing or have the capacity to deal with that uncertainty over time, which may not be the kinds of policies or the kinds of outcomes that we want to see. So right now we're in a phase where we're accelerating what's already underway. We're also increasing uncertainty, and I don't know what as everybody's been saying, I don't really know the outcomes, but it may not necessarily favor, smaller and medium-sized players in this industry.
And I'm curious, Augustine, from you, because I feel like we've been talking a lot about uncertainty in the context of the United States and not really being sure what this administration will implement and what is simply kind of being used as, you know, a tool, almost like a rhetorical tool in terms of policy. And how is that being interpreted in Mexico? What are the aspects of uncertainty that are really affecting export farms there, and how is that manifesting? I'm also thinking of in terms of unauthorized workers being deported back to Mexico, that affecting the labor market there as well. So it's both a migration and a trade issue. I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'll start by the second question. In 2008, we both had a significant number of deportations, but much more significantly, we had a huge number of returns. So in the 2010 census, we had 4 times more Mexicans who reported returning from the US than in the 2000 census. So there was a huge flowback of people, both voluntary and involuntary. And what we got in agriculture was falling wages, very clearly. I mean, you must realize most Mexicans going to the States for the past 30 years came from rural backgrounds, or for the past 90 years came from farms in Mexico. So the fact is that many of these returnees went back to farms. And so in 2019, we interviewed very many. I can't say whether it's 10% or more of the farm workforce. I don't remember right now. But it was a large fraction of the workers that we interviewed that had work experience in the US. Not always, not mostly in US farms, but they did. So they were here and the wages fell. So that by 2014, we hit the lowest real wages ever. So that's something that may happen, and that actually would make the gap between US and Mexican costs and working conditions much larger, because that would mean worsening conditions in Mexico and probably keeping them the same, or if the AWR actually falls in the States, it might not be exactly the same, but it will certainly be better than Mexico. So the gap would widen, and that strangely would lead to the incentive to export to actually become greater, which might mean that at some point the tariffs might be met. So, but exactly, I don't know, and few people know, I think, how this is going to work out, and that is really an unknown. And on the other note, I would very much like to see better planning on both sides of the border. As it is, even without the tariffs or without a new government, we are seeing much more disruption in North American agriculture. So, for example, if you review a business magazine from Canada for 23, 24, you will see that there were very significant areas of agricultural disruption in different ways in different places. And the same thing is happening in the US. So disruption can be much better met by a larger geography that has good communications. And so for the long-term safety of our population, I think keeping this large trade area working, I don't know with tariffs, without tariffs, but keeping it working is extremely relevant for the long-term future of consumers in all countries.
Consumers, and as we've been outlining, certainty for laborers, for workers as well, and agreed upon labor standards, which dovetails quite well into the question that I wanted to pose to Darcy as well on this, in terms of the future of the trade relationship between the US and Mexico and Canada and approaching USMCA review in 2026. A lot of uncertainty there. But just wondering, if you were still a trade negotiator, how would you approach USMCA review in terms of agriculture in kind of the context that Augustine just laid out, in terms of, perhaps there are tariffs on certain things. It doesn't necessarily mean all free trade all the time, but how would you see it? What would be kind of your ideal scenario there?
That's a really interesting question. I think if I were to look at USMCA, I think the temptation, and first of all, what we don't know, we know that the review is mandated. What each country sort of brings to the table and how much of what the scope of that review is it a review? Is it a renegotiation, as we have heard, some hints at? So how that's structured and what the discussion looks like, I think remains to be seen, right? And I think we'll start to see more of those discussions in the next few months to say, how are we going to frame this up? But honestly, if I were to go back to the table with Mexico and Canada, in the context of the USMCA, it is not that these issues would not be on the table. I think there's going to be these grievances, right? We know there has been, competition and concern on tomatoes between Mexico and the US, dairy between the US and Canada. Are we really getting fair treatment and the access and all the things that NAFTA and then USMCA promised? But if you look at what we have said over and over again on this panel, the strong integration of these three markets, the practices of many companies, whether they are headquartered in US, Mexico, or Canada, have investments and a presence and are using migrant laborers in all three countries. And some of them working very hard to use H-2A to have workers based in Mexico who may, pick crops in Mexico during their season and in the US during the season there, so that they have that year-round job, more stable moving back and forth, and are more skilled, which of course creates greater quality, quantity, yield, et cetera, because they understand the crops and the systems well, right? So we have this integration infrastructure that works in our favor. When I look at real challenges for food security, for fairness, for the need to build capacity of others in the agricultural system to be able to combat pest and disease, to behave fairly in their market practices, I would actually focus that review on how US, Canada, and Mexico could work together to try to drive fairer practices in other countries where we see persistent problems. The US, Canada, and Mexico have often coordinated on, new food safety standards and codex, on, building capacity of our partners, on ensuring more science-based decision making. And, Mexico has far more free trade agreements than the US does. It has relationships that, it could use if we got creative about that collaboration. So it's not that these relationships aren't important, but I think strengthening our approach to that of the North American market as a force for looking at how to increase standards and fairness and consistency with our other partners could bring some stability to that North American market. as well. So I frankly see a little bit of the focus on uh, Mexico and Canada as competitors, maybe missing an opportunity for using our voice as a region to deal with what I think are some very difficult and unfair practices in other regions of the world.
Oh my goodness, this has just opened a whole new can of worms that we absolutely do not have time for today, but for future programming, I think, for the Mexico Institute. Thank you so much, Darcy. And just before we close, I would love to turn it back to Laura Ann because just getting a little bit into this question of USMCA and free trade, of course, we talk a lot about how great regional integration is, but as you very shrewdly pointed out earlier on, oftentimes this is not ideal for middle and smaller farmers. And so I'm curious as to how you see USMCA, questions of free trade, North American integration in these markets. How does that affect smaller farmers? But then also, how does it affect workers? Because as you mentioned, it is actually sometimes you find better labor compliance, as Phil also noted, in these larger, kind of more industrial farms. So how do you see that? Briefly, an impossible question, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I think my first thought about how does free trade affect small farmers is I actually think about Mexico, and the way that NAFTA affected farmers in Mexico. And again, we can't go backwards, but we know that, the rise in, undocumented farm workers in the United States in the 1990s was directly, related to NAFTA and, the subsidized commodity crops going into the Mexican market, particularly corn, and the ways that Mexican farmers couldn't compete. So I think the ways that trade affects small farmers is largely something that happens outside the US. And so, so many of the farm workers that I spoke to in the beginning of my career were people that came over directly because of NAFTA. And that's why I always point to farm workers are farmers. Farm workers aren't just workers that came out of nowhere, but they're people with agricultural backgrounds. And so again, that related to the consolidation of farms elsewhere, in Mexico, in other developing countries, large trade agreements, and kind of the power of industrial agriculture in the United States. So there's never been a level playing field in any of this, I don't think, both for scales of farmers or for countries. But we are where we are. And, as much as I think a lot of people would like to go back to farming, that's not necessarily, we have to meet ourselves where we are today. And so, as far as how does this affect, smaller scale farmers in the US, I mean, anything that people are growing that's going to compete with imports that can be produced more cheaply anywhere, be that Mexico or another country, with the higher cost of labor and higher cost of living and higher cost of goods in the United States, people are going to struggle to compete with that. And that's true for agriculture or any other good. So I think, again, thinking about policies that aren't just trade, but thinking about policies that really support small mid-sized farmers in terms of creating a system that would have a more sustainable long-term impact for our health and for the environment. But then, as far as like policies that are directly related to, farm workers, and we haven't really touched on that, but farm workers, the reason that they go to things like the CIW, to these worker centers, is because in the vast majority of states, farm workers don't have the protected right to unionize. And I think that has to be brought up when you talk about labor is, they don't have the same basic rights as other workers. So again, hard to end on that, but it's a complicated system.
Okay, maybe Darcy will close us out then. I just want to give you the
No, I wanted to clarify because I thought, Laura Ann's statement and was, interesting and spot on in terms of work that needs to be done and, protecting and looking at those worker standards is, I think we have a lot of tools already in USMCA and in the number of ways that our three countries work together in other fora that we could, focus that convening power and the capacity that we have. I mean, we're here today because of, your work on this task force and that we can continue it. But if we were going to review or change that agreement, Again, I focused a little bit externally, but I think that we do have examples that are worth sharing. We have common challenges that might be worth addressing in a common way. That doesn't mean we shouldn't use all of those provisions, the labor committee in USMCA, to their fullest extent. The review may also be an opportunity to reinvigorate that. But I don't know that we want to put all of our sort of labor tools within the trade context, right? And we want to make sure that the labor experts, like, my fellow panelists, are at the table, and then it's not just a discussion about those economic flows, but about all those corresponding issues. So we should use it where it is useful, but not maybe hang everything on a trade agreement as the tool.
Completely, Darcy. And I think, yes, to your point, and to Laura Ann's point as well, agriculture requires really holistic kind of policy options that take a systems approach, looking at the food system as a whole. And that is the goal of this task force being so diverse, and the work that we will continue to do. We've launched these policy recommendations today. They're available on the event website. But the work is definitely not finished as this landscape changes so rapidly. So I want to thank you all, panelists, Phil, Augustine, Darcy, and Laura Ann, as well as everyone that has joined us, our AV team at the Wilson Center, for making this possible. And please stay tuned, because we will be doing much more programming on these issues, more to come. Thank you all. Have a lovely, snowy rest of your Wednesday.